Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. The reason why I read that verse from Matthew chapter 6 is because there's some interesting things that need to be considered in that verse. It speaks of the fact that in relationship to the master, it says no man can serve two masters. So by default, it's placing man, all men, in the position of a servant or a slave. Again, it reads, no man, rich or poor, free or bond, can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You, personally, the individual, you cannot serve God and mammon. Now, the word mammon in our modern term would really speak to riches or money or wealth. And we found something very interesting during this time that will not be mentioned, that we've been under for the past 3 years, where people were given an option. The option was to take the inoculation and participate in the current world system, or not be inoculated and be thrust out or be thrown out of the current world system. So we have two kingdoms here. We have the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. And I'm speaking obviously in spiritual terms because at the end of the day, we were originally designed as spirit beings. When Adam and Eve were created, they were fully man, fully woman, fully alive, fully human, and fully spiritual beings before the fall. Now, as a result of the fall, we're all born physically, only to die, but we're not spiritually alive. That's why Christ said in, I believe it is John chapter 3, that we must be born again. There is something that is absent within man that prevents him from him becoming the ultimate person or being that God created him to be. In other words, he's out of fellowship with his creator, because Christ also declared that God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So in order to have a relationship with our creator, we have to be born again. We must be born from above. We must be born of the Spirit of God. And only God can birth us spiritually into spiritual life and awakening. That's a biblical fact. The reality is, when you and I, we've been born physically alive, but in terms of our physical manifestation, you and I had absolutely nothing to do with our entry or the process of us coming into this world physically. We had no say in the matter whatsoever. It was done unto us. The same thing, even more so, would apply in the spiritual realm, right? It's not something that we can do of ourselves. It's something that must be done on our behalf. Now, going back again to Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, it speaks clearly that you cannot serve two masters, which places all men by default in the position of a servant or a slave. Now, I know most of us don't like the idea of being associated with a slave or being a slave, but that's clearly what Christ spoke of, that all men by default are slaves. And the real issue comes down to not necessarily that being a slave is bad. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It can be, but it doesn't have to be, because that's contingent and it's dependent on who your master is. And let me give an illustration, just for example. It's something I've considered and thought about recently. I live here in Canada, in the western country, a beautiful country, although with the past 3 years, we've been under a lot of tyranny under our current Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau. But one of the things I've observed, and in our Western culture, is we have a lot of pet lovers, P-E-T, pet lovers. And those pets in our Western culture they're owned by we even use the word owners, pet owners. So that's another way of saying they are the masters of the pet that they're responsible for the care of. And what I'm getting at is that most people who have pets and are in the position of being the master of that pet treat that pet in such a way that if that pet were had to fend for itself on its own, the lifestyle that it would have would be greatly diminished in comparison to the lifestyle that they have been provided by their masters. Why? Because most pet owners love their pets and go out of their ways to show affection and love towards the object of their desire, which is their pets. They go above and beyond what would even be required of them, simply because they have that love and that devotion to the object of that love, which happens to be their pet. Pets are treated like royalty in Western nations. That's just a given. If you live in any Western nation and you've seen whether the person is wealthy or not, they will treat that pet better than they treat themselves. And that pet is lavished with gifts and adoration and love and affection and so on. The comparison that I'm trying to make is that in a way, that's how God sees us. It's not the exact same comparison, but it's the closest thing I can think of, in the sense that we're always going to be in the position of being a slave, whether we are slaves to Christ, which the Bible speaks of, and for which the Apostle Paul spoke of being a slave of Christ, or we can be a slave of Satan and a slave of this world system. But the bottom line is that we're always going to be in a position of being a slave. The best that we can hope for, you and I, is to whom we are a slave to. And biblically speaking, the best position we could ever find ourselves in, because we will always be a slave, no matter what. We're going to be a slave. But the best position you and I can ever hope for is to be a slave of Christ, because he's going to adore us and love us in an infinitely superior way to that of how a human being loves their pet. Now, I know some people go, what? I don't like that. But it is the best comparison I can give. But the bottom line is that you and I are slaves no matter what. And that we should desire, by the grace of God, and it's only by his grace alone, saving grace, that we will be adopted into the family of God.